Hi, I'm Project Dami, and today I'm going to talk about Boisvert. Boisvert is a YouTube animation horror channel. It also goes by the name Zrimi on Instagram. Despite only having about 20 minutes of content on their channel, Boisvert manages to construct a haunting, disturbing world populated by eldritch gods, angels, and manifestations of the darkest emotions human can feel. These videos are short, full of symbolism, and stitched together with branching paths of coded messaging. Because the series is so densely packed with information, I'm going to spend a decent amount of time unraveling and analyzing the secrets hidden within. And in case it wasn't obvious, the series is disturbing. Mentions of extreme isolation, loneliness, and depression, as well as a fair amount of violent, if animated imagery lie ahead. And since this is either the first or second video on my channel, I'm just going to give a heads up. This is artistic analysis. I'm not under the impression there's a true crime cult hidden in the Boisvert YouTube video, although if anyone would like to start one, I call the role of Kool-Aid tester. Oh, and by the way, it's pronounced Boisvert, not Boisvert, at least I think. The first animation on the Boisvert channel... The first animation on the Boisvert channel was a breakout hit. This video was made in the midst of the pandemic, the quarantine/lockdown stage, the first one out of many. We're introduced to the most commonly occurring character in the Boisvert extended universe, this sweet boy who from now on, I'm going to call Fourhorn. Fourhorn is here to tell you to keep up with your exercise, wake up at a reasonable hour, and
ignore the noises from the basement.
They're shown drawing a shadow creature before walking downstairs to an empty room and seeing that very same creature. The music distorts and the screen is wreathed in static. The shadow guy shudders towards the screen and says,
"Do you know what day it is? When did you last go outside? When did you last see your friends? Your family?"
I mean, listen, I'd like to keep my therapist in the
Basement.
too, but due to federal regulations and budgetary constraints, I don't think it's in the cards. So, beyond the fact that this video is of excellent quality, and the character design shows so much potential, the sound and visuals all coming together to make an excellent work of horror animation, what does it mean? As we go through their videos, I want to analyze this content in three ways when relevant: metaphor, literal, and overarching. Meaning, we'll be talking about what's happening on the screen, following any secrets or hidden messages like codes and such, and considering the characters and their actions in the context of the story, as well as what the work means outside the bounds of what we see in the direct lore, looking at the events of the story as analogies to emotional or metafictional storytelling. Finally, at the end of the video, we'll consider every part of the story as a unified whole, the characters and ideas throughout summed up to tell a singular narrative, as well as talking about artistic themes in the work overall. Looking at this video alone, I'd say that Fourhorn represents attempts to stay positive, keep going, to move forward, and that Shadow Guy represents the doubt, depression, and dread building up underneath the surface these hopeful self-care mantras seek to cope with. Whether or not they're working, though, is up for debate. Another reading is that Shadow Guy is Fourhorn, and when he's given into depression, a change takes form. I think that because Shadow Guy is talking to the point of view character, I lean towards Shadow Guy being representational. In a literal sense, this episode serves to declare an important fact of Fourhorn's life. There are dark things in the basement. A pair of gloved hands shoves away a Polaroid photo of a person facing away from the camera, opening a game cartridge for a game called Tenant. They reveal the art on the game and see a title in front of a sea of doors, two of them blackened. We put the game into an N64. We see a glitchy, black and white title. They enter the game. They enter the name Oreo, which means Light of God. The text on the game reads, "There is a job you must do. Pay him a visit." The character goes up to talk to this shape, half in shadow, and it changes to another white-horned character, titled The Receptionist. These hands don't look the same. The receptionist purrs and gives the character Oriel's flashlight and tells the player to evict anyone without a mark on their doors. The goal of the game seems to be to evict tenants from an apartment complex for multiple infractions, and as the player walks past doors with red X's, something skitters overhead. The character goes back and then continues and kicks in a door. We see legs, then 10 white eyes appear outside the flashlight's beam, and the game crashes. Now, I'm a Patreon of Boisvert, and hey, you should be too. And they've mentioned working on an RPG Maker game before, and it's clear that if they did, it would be interesting to say the least. Besides that, I think that this video is just what it says on the title, a demo for a game that will, unfortunately, never exist. But hey, let's keep some of this symbolism in mind, these creatures, these houses in its apartment complex, and some of the character shapes we might see again.
This video is
Extremely fast and frenetic, with a lot packed in. In order to analyze it better, I slowed it down frame by frame, and there's a lot to say for how short it is. In this video, unfortunately struck by YouTube copyright to the song Haunted by Laura Les, we see a person running down a hall, away from a creeping mass of black tendrils. They pull up their sleeves and punch a wall. A kaleidoscope of hands appears, and they pull back their arm, now covered in some kind of black ichor. The hole they punched appears to now have black tendrils and liquid on it. The hands return, and they look up to see a black figure at the end of the hallway that wasn't there before. I think it's not a character we've seen before due to the differing head shape. The POV character runs towards them. The eye/hand thing appears again, and the video ends. Keep this creature in mind, it too will appear later. This is information I could glean by watching essentially frame by frame, which really goes to show how quality animation can serve as an excellent medium for investigative horror. The fact that this happens in reality, edited together with animation, makes it even more disturbing, like the shaky first-person camera, the POV of a person who's completely lost their mind. Let's make a leap and assume that whatever happened to Forhorn is happening to this POV character. Black tendrils and creatures appearing out of nowhere, be they supernatural or a paranatural representation of their mindset, starts to take over the hallway, and the character starts to become a shadow creature himself. He tries to ward it off by punching the wall, shaking himself out of the state. What results isn't clarity, but visions of hands, mouths, and eyes. In Burning.mp4, we return to Forhorn. It's been a year now, and indeed it has, almost 9 months in real time since we last saw our poor protagonist. And they're not doing well. They seem to have grown a 5th horn, which makes their antlers asymmetrical and throws off my naming conventions, and might be visual shorthand for the fact that they're really going through it. Even waking up is a struggle for 4 horn, 5 horn, you know. And they can only watch as people go back outside. Isolation has become a cycle for them. And yeah, I really relate to this. The character is asked, "Why are you in the basement?" as we zoom out on the stairs and see them trying to draw. They tell themselves, beg themselves to do something, anything, and they slam their head against their desk, black ichor pouring out from the walls. The Shadow Man takes over their body and calls them a coward.
It's tonight. You bargaining as you brain. You're still in the basement. Breathed in flames.
So this both confirms and deconfirms both interpretations of Shadow Guy, that they're a side of Forhorn or manifestation of their depression, but also that they're a second personality or side of Forhorn's consciousness. Both are true at once. Forhorn and Shadow Guy are inexorably linked. The basement is brought up again, along with the words "decaying as you breathe," and the words "wreathed in flames." The former could refer to that sense of emotional or personality rot that occurs in long periods of isolation or repetitivity, or a literal rot. The "wreathed in flames" quote, too, could be a reference to either burning emotional pain or an actual burning fire. This lack of a concrete reality might point to this house being a dream world of some sort, or the basement being a reference to the mental state of Forhorn, a part of their mind that they aren't supposed to visit. The way I see it, the metaphorical interpretation surrounds the idea that this is a series spawned out of isolation and depression, that the events occurring to Fourhorn are manifestations of his experience in quarantine and of his mental health. The literal definition is much vaguer, and I see two possibilities. The first is a kind of magical realism, where these shadow beings appear at times of stress, and are either summoned by or are the cause of self-harm, examples being in this video, or in the walls where shadow beings in black ichor appear before the character punches a wall, only for them to fall deeper into these visions. The second is that this is a spiritual happening to the Fourhorn character, who is already dead. Their spirit is being toyed with by a demon, perhaps the Shadow Guy, or one of the other more supernatural-leaning characters we'll see later. This would explain the basement as a literal place in which they're buried, perhaps with the burning of a literal fire raging around them, or maybe the flames of hell. I lean, however, towards metaphor. So this is the video that served as my trailhead to the project, and the story of how I found it is actually pretty interesting. I am, unfortunately, a sewer slut enjoyer, and I saw this video, Sewer Slut New Love They Don't Know Mix, in my recommended. Now, it's basically just a sped up version of this already pretty fast song, New Love, but I watched it once and forgot about it. That was months ago, and, well, I got into noise music and was researching new albums. And what do you know, in YouTube recommended videos for Japan Noise, alongside Hanatarash and Hijo Kaiden, this video. Now, this does demonstrate that if you want to find stuff on YouTube, you should use the search function, because although YouTube's algorithm is terrible for just about everything else, it is pretty interesting the ways it'll just recommend random shit to you. And well, this video is great. It's a pretty good meme, and it helped me find an excellent band, 1-800-PAIN. But it doesn't provide much information on its own. Why is this creature dancing so hard? And what don't they know? Now, I received some pertinent information from the creator when I first asked to cover their work. They gave me a hint and a name. The hint was that the triangle-headed creature first appears in Self-Care PSA, and Burning.mp4 is a different entity from Room, masked triangle-headed gentleman. So, this is Room.
They don't know.
In this video, we see a game over screen with the words "It's over" and the option to continue or quit in front of a masked character with a quilled head. When we try to hit continue, it says "Not a chance," and this creature flashes a rictus grin. He fades away into a second character with spikes or fur all over his long head and body. He's wearing pants, which implies that every character thus far has been naked. He approaches a door and sees the masked character dancing frantically, insane text and strange floating beings appearing behind him. The animation here shows the masked character's body morphing, secondary versions of himself appearing and replacing each other, and it feels like some kind of eldritch being shifting and changing before our eyes. Spiky Head stares at the camera and pulls a knife from his mouth, running into the room, and stabs the quilled god as the music stops. Behind the quilled god is the word "quit." Behind Spiky Head's face is the word "continue." So, although the masked character's face reminds me of the character from They Don't Know, whose name seems to be Room, I'm going to assume that they're either of the same species or faction, or the same entity with a very different physical form. After all, this being has shown to be very capricious with his physicality. I know big words. When he dances, a bunch of insane text shows up on screen, moving very fast backwards. I took the time to jot it all down, but it's pretty indecipherable, and I think what it makes me feel is more important than its actual words. And, well, it makes me feel bad. It makes me feel like whoever's writing it is wrestling with a deep depression and apathy, and the only coping mechanism they can reach for is rage, hate, and resentment. And again, there are literal and metaphorical interpretations we can draw here, as well as a fusion of the two. In a literal sense, I think it's fair to place the Spiky Head in the position of the hero, as he is the icon of continue, and might be the force fighting against the darkness that seems to be creeping into this world at the cracks. It seems like he scored a victory here, but I'm not sure. The thing he killed has a face we've seen before, and I think it'll be an important being or group or entity or eldritch horror in the story to come. All I know is that he's boyfriend material. Metaphorically, these might be representations of the will of another character, of the will to quit and to persevere, the text we see being the representation of the subconscious of a character, likely our boy Fourhorn. It might be that when these thoughts and this entity are left to fester, Shadow Guy takes over, and his will to continue has beat back these dark impulses. And lastly, in a more mimetic sense, this might be a inside you are two wolves scenario, but for Fourhorn, his two wolves are an eldritch god and a furry with a knife. In this next video, we meet the hands from in the walls again, jumbled messages appearing as they flash strange gestures. I want to call this being the Seraphim. Bible passages appear on screen as these little creatures with the Quilled God's mask hover around. A version of the Quilled God with tentacles made of arms appears and begins to speak.
A chasm appears upon the face of my watch. My past decapitated. I search blindly for what I will not find.
A mouth appears with hands coming out of a pillar in the strange 3D space they occupy, and asks the question.
Blinded by your own hand, as surely as if you had held the burning garden. 1,000 decisions made in the name of a desecrated existence. Look up from your watch and tell me when you will grant forgiveness to the one most lacking.
He is answered with,
When it is deserved.
Now, this video is one of my favorites so far, with some of the best sound design. I think looking at it without digging a bit deeper, though, would be a mistake, because a lot is hidden in this video. The Bible quotes that show on screen are as follows. 1 Corinthians 13:11, "When I became a child, I used to speak like a child, think like a child, reason like a child. When I became a man, I did away with childish things." Proverbs 20:11, "Even small children are known by their actions, so is their conduct really pure and upright?" And Romans 3:23, "For all who have sinned fall short of the glory of God." I think if we're to assume that the one most lacking is our protagonist character, this scene and the subtext of these Bible verses, all surrounding forgiveness, sin, and childhood, represent a lot. Fourhorn committed some sin or act for which he feels extremely guilty for. He knows he was a child but still feels guilt for what he perceives as his crime, and seeks forgiveness. The Quilled God or angel or seraphim, whatever we're to call it, doesn't believe he deserves it. All of this biblical imagery could suggest this series takes place in a literal afterlife, contributing to the theory that our protagonist is dead. But pretentious art analyzer as I am, I don't think this space is a literal heaven per se, more that the Quilled God is a false prophet who exists within the mind of Fourhorn, either in a metaphorical sense as a manifestation of the deep well of pain and guilt we've seen, or in a literal sense as an afflicting spirit. Moreover, let's talk about the Seraphim. I'm not quite sure yet, but I'm interested to see what this character might represent. One theory I do have about the Seraphim, always appearing before confrontations with supernatural elements, is that it might represent an uncertain voice in Fourhorn's head. In its first appearance, it appears before the protagonist punches a wall, or black ichor and shadow beings appear. However, in I Met a Beautiful Angel, the Seraphim seems to condemn the Quilled God, its speech implying that the Quilled God may be the reason the one most lacking has been unable to be forgiven, or forgive himself. Perhaps this is why Fourhorn has remained in this cycle of self-hatred. But between its two appearances, the colors are different, this inner voice both being the voice of confusion and pain, and the voice that seeks to mend this mental anguish the protagonist is experiencing. So initially, I didn't have much to say on this video. I thought it was, in the same way as Tenant, or the upcoming video, an unrelated but extremely good animation. This section would have, well, just been praised for it. But then I came back to it, and there's a lot more here than I previously thought. After we first see him in darkness, we're introduced to this little guy. We then cut to a security camera on a concrete floor, shrouded in shadow. The text reads, "It is quiet. They're all far away." And so, it is quiet. We cut back to the security footage and see this little guy again, but this time he's not a little guy. He's a big fella, and he is real, not clickbait. This time the text reads, "Don't breathe. You'll ruin it." A black hand appears from under his cloth, and we see him wandering around. When we cut back to the dialogue screen, he's gone dark. He says again that it is quiet. In the physical world, he's sitting down in the shadows, the clock in the corner of the security camera moving incredibly fast. This text, disappearing as quickly as it appears, reads, "The quilled god rages, destroys the ropes which held him aloft." Now this shadowy arm is all the way out, and when we cut back to reality, similar arms are coming out of the cloth, and it looks, well, completely horrifying. We cut back, and the shadow version of the creature has escaped the dialogue box, the text illegible. At this point, the complex character has been completely superseded, and we see this being with 4 arms and crutches, reminiscent of the quilled god's design. Finally, the last text in the video reads, "We don't talk to them anymore, and so it is quiet." You may wonder, what's so much deeper about this video? The text seems unrelated to what we've seen so far, and the only direct connection to what feels like the main storyline is the legs that appear and the mention of the quilled god. At this point, I was ready to just write this video off as set dressing. Efforts to make this already lonely black and white world feel all the more lonely with the repeat mentions of quietness and everyone disappearing. Well, maybe not. There's more here. In the upper right-hand corner of the CCTV camera feed, we see a timestamp. But when the monstrous version of the character appears on screen, it glitches out and starts displaying impossible times and letters. This is code, hexadecimal code to be precise, and it leads us to an Imgur link which shows us this picture, the knife from Continue. Around the knife is more hexadecimal code, translating to, "I will come for you." It's what he will have wanted. When we last saw the knife, it was in the hand of Spikyhead or Dogtooth, and we can assume that this is his internal monologue. Perhaps the being he's going after is the quilled god, but we already saw him stab this being, so either this secret dialogue takes place before that, or there are more eldritch beings left to hunt down. And in any case, who is the he who would have wanted it? This series has a lot of depth, and don't worry, we're gonna go deeper. Okay, before we continue, it's time for a little game of Who's That Pokemon, as a lot of characters have been introduced. This is Forhorn, the protagonist of the story. He's an artist, struggling with depression, guilt, and isolation. He's just like me for real. This is Shadow Guy, either the cause of Forhorn's strife or a manifestation of it. He appears when Forhorn is at his worst, and appears to be the result of his pent-up emotions. This is Room. Say hi, Room.
They don't know.
This is Spikyhead, although I've seen some commenters refer to him as Dogtooth, so I'm going to obstinately continue calling him Spikyhead. Cope. The first time we see him, he's stabbing an eldritch god to death, and seems to be a force fighting against the strange beings that exist in this world. This is the Quilled God. Say hi, Quilled God. This inscrutable mass seems to be the voice of self-hatred, guilt, and stagnation. He was first seen in the video called It's Over, alongside Spikyhead, who was represented by the word continue. In that video, the Quilled God was represented by the word quit. This is the Seraphim. Say hi, Seraphim. The Seraphim is a being, or perhaps 2 beings, that appear twice, the first time preceding disaster in the walls, and the second asking the Quilled God for forgiveness on behalf of, I think, Forhorn. And finally, this is the Complex, although the Complex also seems to be a place, as well as a little guy. He's just a lovable friend who has the right amount of arms. Let's get back to the videos. After we see some more sick dance moves from Room, we're taken to the perspective of a character moving through this empty, void-like space, all corridors and stairs. The camera shake and movement is convincing, which adds a lot to the feeling of uncanny reality in this unreal, liminal space. We can see dark clouds in a much higher resolution outside the windows and under this bridge, We see Room again, who says,
but it is to no avail.
We approach a gravestone and the colors invert. Dark hands reminiscent of the quilled god come down from the ceiling, and we see a triangle-headed figure wearing a mask, sitting in a chair that rises up from an abyss of black ichor, flanked by two statues of hooded figures. We see the face raise up from its slump and a mouth appears, and then we see these creatures in the void. It's scary as fuck. So there are some things to note, the first of which is the voice. I presume it's Room, and he says,
And when you come near,
when we first see the POV approaching the gravestone. Maybe Room is dead? Secondly, the last words of this video,
you will see in my eyes fear.
are subtitled as love, but peur translates from French into fear. I saw a reading of the dialogue in the comments that I like, that it's about struggling to reach out and connect to others, detaching yourself from other people, and fearing contact. I like this reading, but this artist's work is anything if not multi-layered. And although I think reading this as a monologue on this topic tracks, I think there's another answer as well. Room is definitely a different character from Fourhorn and his shadow, who I think is likely to be the perspective character for this video, as in previous videos. Thus far, I think I've developed an understanding of this work as a character study, perhaps as a self-reflection on this Fourhorn character. He's who we start out with, and his character is the most rooted in reality, with mentions of real-world events like quarantine. I think that it's also possible that Room is talking directly to Fourhorn now, that his words are to be taken literally, that Room is the one feeling isolated, alone, and reaching out. I'm not sure yet, but I do wonder what significance the grave has here. Perhaps in Fourhorn's past, Room was his friend who reached out to him in a time of loneliness and was ignored, and didn't manage to continue. Maybe that sin that Fourhorn feels is unforgivable is the fact that he failed to help his friend, perhaps due to his own mental illness, which he views as cowardice. That would also explain the design similarities between the Quilled God and Room. They have very similar masks, and the Quilled God seems to have a variety of forms, perhaps each one representing an anguish the protagonist feels. The overlap in their faces could hint that Room is the source of Fourhorn's guilt and self-hatred. Now, because this reading hinges on Room being the voice and the character in the chair, I just wanted to show something. The artist's Twitter does confirm that this character is Room in the notes of this sketch, so I'm inclined to believe that the voice we hear is Room too. Another element that lends credence to this point is that we've heard both Room and Shadow Guy's voice before. Shadow Guy's voice sounds like this, and Room sounds like this. Let's compare them.
They don't know.
In this video, we see a triangle-headed character, and because he's maskless, I'm going to assume it's Shadow Guy. He sits in a room full of noise and unreadable text. The subtitles say, "They are singing with pain in their heart. It is nothing short of a miracle." The camera pans around wildly, and then we cut to a CCTV feed, reminiscent of the camera in the Complex video. But in what looks like, if distorted and washed out, an interior location. Maybe a basement? Maybe the basement? Then again, the sigil in the corner of the screen is the same sigil from the Complex. Shadow Guy appears again.
The clawing, isolation, that embedded itself beneath my heart.
We're taken to a previously seen location, the gravestone with two statues, but an unfamiliar white figure stands next to the grave. The voice says,
I can repudiate it no longer. This is my home. It is empty. It is cold.
Dissecting this video part by part, let's start with the first sentence that you can only see in the subtitles. The phrase, "they are singing with pain in their heart," could refer to either using they as a singular pronoun to describe Shadow Guy or whatever character we're seeing, Or it might make more sense paired with the more holy terminology
It is empty.
to refer to the creatures we've seen in the presence of angels. Or, and this could make more sense paired with the more holy terminology of it can only be seen as a miracle, could be referring to the creatures we've seen in the presence of angels, these little hovery guys. This might make sense because the only time the musical cues have been singing was in the Beautiful Angel video. Then again, the singing they can continue with, despite all the pain in their heart, could refer to the process of making art despite all this depression and pain around them, referring both to Forhorn, who we've seen as an artist, and, well, the artist of the series. Now for the second shot, the CCTV feed. I'm assuming that this is one of the two locations we've heard spoken of previously, either the basement or the complex. We cut back, and Shadow Guy is tearing his stomach open, and we hear a voice.
The clawing. Isolation. That embedded itself beneath my hearth.
Very subtly, the voice line starts out mixed and affected, closer to how Shadow Guy's voice has sounded in the past, but transitions very quickly to the bassy sound that Room's voice has. We also see the gravestone, last contextualized in a video with Room. I think this is direct confirmation that Room exists in the mind of Forhorn in some way, appearing when he's at his darkest moments, as represented by the Shadow Guy. The video is called Consequences, and, well, I wonder about that. Consequences of what? One reading is that the gravestone represents some consequence to an action our protagonist feels guilt and pain for. Another, that his current state is the consequence of the isolation he exists in. The isolation, cold and empty as it is his home now. And don't worry, I didn't miss that QR code in the corner, although surprisingly, although this video has 50,000 views, the QR code video only has 2,000. In the QR code video, we see the "this is what she sees" cam from the fella in the complex. It says, "Love is not a guarantee within anybody's life. Anyone unfortunate enough could go through life without ever feeling love. It would be an entirely alien concept to them." And as they go shadowy, the video glitches and then continues. As we grow closer to the core, the words become harder to say. Soon I will be silent. It'll be better that way. Now, the thumbnail of this video is a realistic image of a shirtless body, the head a triangle. I think that this dialogue from the complex might represent a source of Forhorn's pain, this feeling of being unlovable and like they've never been loved before. They want to be silent, to isolate, because it'll be better that way in their mind. And I think the name The Complex was an excellent choice for this character/place. A complex can be a building, like a prison complex, but complex can also refer to a core pattern of emotions, memories, and perceptions built around a theme. In this case, a theme like loneliness. And, well, as we get closer to the core of that complex, the words to describe how Forhorn and Shadow Guy feel become harder to say. But that line about wanting to become silent worries me. And now, in keeping with that theme of loneliness, I'm going to leave you alone for a little to watch this next video, Prelude, Angel's Warning.
And it was said unto them that this was the price to be paid, a complex unending, but there beyond all measure. In despair, they left, not in sorrow but bitterness, the avarice of their blind promise.
Forhorn has received his punishment, a complex unending. Perhaps the room we had seen Shadow Guy sit in previously is this complex, a prison of sorts. And the sin that brought them there was the avarice of a blind promise. Again, we get more hints as to what guilt might be resting on the protagonist's shoulders, but the details are still left vague. The creature that appears out of the Seraphim's mouth is interesting to me. Although he only hums, the subtitles for his speech say, "I will speak half-truths no longer. I leave you with only a question. When does a home become a complex? And when does a complex become home?" He doesn't have quite the same mask as the Quilled God, but both have a circular face with spikes sticking out. This one looks more formed somehow, and the association with the seraphim isn't lost on me. It could be a reinterpretation of the design by the creator, or a new form, but the forms of the Quilled God have been somewhat consistent in iconography thus far. What I think this could be is a visual reference to the Quilled God, without the Quilled God's voice. This is just a tulpa or statue that the seraphim is showing us that the Quilled God's hate and resentment has calcified into a way of being for Fourhorn and his shadow, a complex unending. You'll pardon the interruption from the future. Well, apparently an entire industrial noise show is happening in the construction site behind my house, but I needed to clarify something here that I didn't think I did a good job of explaining. I don't think there's any effective difference between the Quilled God and these little cherub-like miniature versions of him that fly around him. They have his same face, although his mask is more distorted. They always show up with him, but I just think they're versions of him, basically. They don't really have a voice of their own other than just being his entourage, and they might as well represent him. So when I discount the fact that the seraphim just has one of these in his mouth, I think it's because it doesn't matter. It's still the Quilled God, the Quilled God's opinions and hot takes that he posts on Twitter. That's it. Let's get back to the video and answer the question, when does a complex become a home? Well, I think this is a play on the concept of a prison cell becoming a castle. You can become complacent in isolation or punishment and prefer familiar restrictions to the unrestricted unknown. Perhaps this is the mental state of stagnation that we find our protagonist in. This video doesn't do much more than compounding upon existing ideas and imagery. The imagery of angelic beings that haunt Fourhorn's guilty conscience. The imagery of clasped and reaching hands as if seeking connection, in this instance being broken quite violently. The idea of a sin or crime causing a weight of guilt and the need for punishment. And the idea of that punishment manifesting in a mental, metaphysical, or metaphorical prison, which we've come to know as the complex. But this video, after all, is just a prelude for the most important video in the series thus far. Now, the reason this video is so important is because it connects most of the characters we've seen so far, and contextualizes them a lot. Although 3 videos have come out since zoning ordinance, we may have to cover them in a follow-up video, because I think this video concludes a lot of the first arc. But I get the feeling there is lots more left to come. Dogtooth is dragging the body of the Quilled God towards a door filled with a familiar static. We cut towards a grayed-out, messy room with the complex watching a white screen. Shadow Guy sits in his chair, pale eyes glowing in the dark. He looks up at the ceiling, a pit with an exit on top of it. I think this is a location in the CCTV feeds. He walks into the shadow on the concrete ground in the CCTV feed, and we cut back to Shadow Guy peering up the hole in his ceiling. He only has one eye now, and it looks similar to the eye from the Seraphim. Perhaps he's reached some kind of clarity. Dogtooth enters the room above the pit and faces the complex, or perhaps the guardian of the complex, as we should call him. They have one of the sickest duels imaginable, fighting to music that speeds up and slows down, with a silhouetted outline of perhaps Shadow Guy or perhaps Room in the background. This silhouette is something I'm not sure of yet, but it might represent the memory of Room, only silhouetted, a vague impression looming over Shadow Guy. The fight feels video gamey and brutal at the same time, with little details like the complex holding up a mirror to defend, or how its eyes turn into the sigil from the complex video when it uses its flatline attack. It's just so good. And don't get me started on how this absolute Giga Chad restarts his heart with his hand. It's
sick as hell.
Although the body Spiky Head pulls the knife out of was originally the same corpse we saw in Continue, when Complex pushes it into the pit, it looks far closer to Shadow Guy or Fourhorn, with a flattened top of its head, although I'm not sure if that was intended. Either way, we get a literal JRPG-style combat screen with some interesting details. For example, Spikey's profile picture is a dog, but the complex is the Quilled God, with the statuses being enraged and absent respectively. Maybe Dogtooth is too enraged to tell the difference? Maybe they're the same? One of the options alongside attack and items is 5 days ago, and his attacks are also oddly named. Either way, the knife attack misses, and as Shadow Guy is eating the corpse of the Quilled God, the knife falls on him. We then see one of the most terrifying designs in the series, bar none. I feel like this horrid character is meant to represent death or the devil. It's so uniquely repulsive, different from every other design. This halo of fingers, the real mouth on a white outline of hair, it's chilling, it's eldritch, it's gross. And it's important to realize that this creature's silhouette is the same that was lurking next to the pit in Consequences, as if he's been watching us the whole time. Let's hear what this thing has to say.
Can you picture an empty room with yourself at the center? Answer me quickly and honestly. Can you picture an empty room with yourself at the center?
I don't know.
Is there still enough space in the hallway to continue?
I don't know.
The complex is an aberration, yet you have treaded a hole within yourself that only it may fill. Do you know what you must do?
I don't.
Cry out, for there is slaughter in the new Jerusalem. Cry out, so that one may ignore.
After we hear these lines, Shadow Guy reaches his hand out and takes its face off, revealing maggots beneath, and puts on the mask. He's Joker-pilled now, and I'm almost certain that this character, Shadow Guy, just became Room. He seems to have gained immeasurable power, and grabs the complex, seemingly making him disappear. And again, his form is reminiscent of the Quilled God, all these legs peeking out from under a blanket, the same as the complex, but this version is blackened with Room's mask in place. The Morse code at the end says goodbye and hello. This video is amazing, probably the best so far, but deserved praise aside, I think it's very important to understand what happened here. Let's start with Dogtooth, Spiky Head, whatever. When he defeats the Quilled God, he drags his corpse to the complex. It's what he would have wanted according to the hidden dialogue in a previous video. And when he meets the complex, which is both a character and a prison, he confronts it. I think that if the Quilled God represents the will to quit, the complex represents the will to rot, to isolate, to ignore everything else. Unlike the Quilled God, who's contextualized by these angelic choirs and morphing forms, the complex is surrounded by clocks, numbers, and security cameras. Like I said, a sense of security and complacency. Dogtooth can't tell the difference in his rage, but to him, they're all just sources of pain, isolation, or self-hatred. These are things that Dogtooth seems to be fighting against, although it's hard not to look at him as menacing with his design. In attempting to defeat the complex, he drops the knife into Shadow Guy's prison. I think it's a combination of eating the Quilled God's flesh and being stabbed with the knife that activated Shadow Guy's encounter with this being. Another way to look at it, and the way I prefer, is that this is Shadow Guy acknowledging his guilt in some way, consuming it and making it part of him. When he becomes Room, I don't know if it's a one-for-one transformation. What might be happening more is that Room was the manifestation of his guilt, but this powered-up version of Room is the same but different, a acceptance of that guilt. If Shadow Guy represents these emotions that Fourhorn has pushed down into a complex in his mind, then perhaps the fact that he's consumed the Quilled God and defeated the complex means that in some way he's acknowledged these problems, but that's just the first step, as he's told by this thing.
The complex is an aberration, Yet you have shredded a hole within yourself that only it may fill.
After being told these harsh truths by the mourner, he becomes motivated to finally leave this apartment and leave the complex. And I think that although this event is played as incredibly sinister, due to the atmosphere and character designs of this series, there's a reading of these events that are positive. Assuming that Dogtooth is a manifestation of the desire to continue, even if that desire is fueled by rage, when his knife reached Shadow Guy alone in a complex of isolation and regret, maybe that gave him the power to fight against it. And, freeing yourself from that deep depression and acknowledging the problems affecting you is never pretty. It's never just walking out into the sunlight. It's noticing the darkness and walking through it. And getting out of that isolation is the first step. But that darkness doesn't go away when you decide to address it. That being said, the first instinct of a deeply isolated, bitter, and pained individual isn't always good, and although it seems to mark a positive change in Shadow Guy and Fourhorn's life, I still worry about what might happen next. I think the series has done a great job of cultivating fear and anxiety, and that dread and apathy that this series summons is really good for this nuanced portrayal of mental health. I really look forward to what comes next. So before we wrap up this video and I give my full perspective, I just want to say that this is just one person's interpretation. I love works like this, where a group of people can all look at it and all take away an entirely different thing. My interpretation, though, is this. Fourhorn is our anchor to reality, a real person deep in depression, disassociation, and engulfed in a slog of bitterness and hate. Shadow Guy is a manifestation of his pent-up anguish, a version of Fourhorn that takes over in their darkest moments. In the mental world of Fourhorn, there's a whole pantheon of characters, reminiscent of eldritch gods and strange demons, but among these, there's just one I want to focus on. That's Room. Room is the character I know the least about, and the character I have the most speculation for. I think that a central weight upon Fourhorn is guilt represented in part by the quilled god, who's always framed in biblical language and a constant undercurrent of sin and punishment. But what is this guilt for? The avarice of a blind promise, apparently. But what does that mean? Well, I think the person this promise was made to is dead. And I think that Room represents this person. And like I said in Entirely Beloved, as the POV camera approaches a gravestone, the voice of Room says, "As you come near." The reason Room and the Quill God look similar is that Room is the source of Fourhorn's guilt. In I Met a Beautiful Angel, we see some Bible verses referring to crimes committed as a child, which gives some more hints and concepts to what that guilt might be. And the fact that Shadow Guy's form becomes similar to Room as he takes on new power is important too, perhaps representing that he's chosen to cope with that guilt rather than letting it fester. I think that Fourhorn coming to acknowledge this guilt means that the next part of the series will focus more on this past that he seems to have. And with that, we've reached the end of what I view as part 1. The will to continue has defeated the will to quit. The quilled god has fallen, and Shadow Guy rises out of his prison, Room's mask upon his face, on a quest to defeat the complex. So that was most of Boisvert's videos up to this point. It's a remarkably vulnerable, honest, and real depiction of depression and isolation, as well as a surrealist character study, demonstrated through some of the best and most unique horror animation I've ever seen. It's something really special, and I'm so glad I found it. It's worth so much analysis and artistic respect, and it's a really good series, Remy. I'm excited to see where it goes. We'll cover Boisvert again. This video, all 40 minutes of it, surrounded a mere 10 or so videos, and the creator's already uploaded more since I started. I'll be keeping up with them, and when I think that another video marks the end of an arc, or that the end of the series drops, I'll do a part 2. And on this channel, I plan to cover everything from manga, J-horror films, internet horror like ARGs, web series, and analog horror, as well as music and games. Of course, it's always themed around the dark and macabre. But with all the recording, editing, rendering, and suffering I have to do to make videos like this, another full-length video will take a while. Between then and now, I plan to update the channel with shorter videos that don't require so much work, like Q&As, reviews, iceberg videos, maybe a director's commentary on this video, and maybe some virtual vlogs. After all, the real eldritch horror at the end of the day is the YouTube algorithm. And, well, in order to feed that gaping maw, that blind idiot god that will one day swallow us whole, like and subscribe, and maybe check out my Patreon, as you'll get videos early and be able to support a new horror creator. I'm Project Dollmeat, and I hope you can see why I think Boisvert is the darkest animation on YouTube.